Can you talk about issues, both economic and non-economic, that would lead to the kind of changes that began to be ushered in late 1978, 1979?
I think there was, on the part of the leadership, and ultimately the most important part of the leadership, namely Deng Xiaoping, a sense that they had lost time. They'd lost decades when they could have been growing, in which they really weren't doing very much, except, say, in the military sphere and the like. But it wasn't a crisis. This was not a deep recession that happened in 1976, 78. The economy actually was picking up a little bit. And the biggest change, of course, is the death of Mao, and then the purge of the so-called Gang of Four, of Mao's wife Jiang Qing and the other three members of this radical leftist group. And that basically opened up the possibility of changing things. And you had Deng Xiaoping, who was, in some sense, in the Chinese tradition of some of the Chinese people of the past century, which is he wanted China to be wealthy and powerful, but he had himself no clear idea of what the changes should be. He just knew that they could do better. He himself made visits to Sichuan, where he was from, and looked at the extreme poverty. And then, of course, for the Chinese population as a whole, he goes to Japan. Going to U.S. and seeing that the U.S. is far ahead of China, it wouldn't have been a shock to anybody in China, because the U.S. was assumed to be wealthy and powerful and so on. But Japan was not. I mean, and Japan back in the 1950s, Japan wasn't all that well off. It was better off than China by a significant fraction. It was a bit better off than Korea and Taiwan, but it was still, I mean, only 2% of the people had automobiles, things like that. And then you go to this Japan that Deng visits, and it's on television all over China, showing this, everybody with shiny automobiles and massive traffic and huge buildings and everything looking wealthy and so on, and that was a real shock to the Chinese, at least the more educated part of the population. And so there was a lot of interest in trying to get growth, get things going faster. As I say, no real idea of how to do it, and no real idea of just how much growth they could get. And that then starts, Deng Xiaoping, one further point here. Deng Xiaoping is critical in this because certain things they would have done almost automatically, whether he was there or not. Opening up to foreign trade. That had been, the leftists had criticized anybody who used foreign technology. Mao had talked about how peasants can do as well as scientists in laboratories on finding new technologies or whatever. And so getting rid of that kind of attitude was critical to any change. But once the Gang of Four were out, there was an immediate effort to turn outward to get foreign technology. And the problem was, they basically said to the various industrial enterprises and others, okay, you can go now buy foreign technology. And so there's this huge movement on part of these enterprises to go buy foreign technology. One of the Hong Kong banks tried to do a calculation of how many letters of intent to purchase had been signed, and it was something like $500 or $600 billion worth of things. Well, China had exports of just under $10 billion of the foreign exchange to pay for it. So there was no way they were going to get anywhere. So that, then you had to think about, where are you going to get the foreign exchange? Well, you're going to have to either export. And then the question is, what are you going to export? Well, for a little while in the late 70s, they hoped they could export oil. And then
this is right after the oil shocks of the mid-70s.
Right, and the prices were up, and they invited the oil companies in to explore, particularly the offshore oil. They had a little bit of oil in the Daqing field and then in western China and so on. But then when the initial efforts to find oil offshore were not very successful, and they clearly weren't going to solve their foreign exchange problems that way. And then what was left pretty much was manufacturing, and so they started down the road of manufacturing exports. It was very similar to how Korea and Taiwan reached the same conclusions, but they reached them back in the early 60s. China reached them only in the 78, 9, 80 era. It could have turned out differently. There was another major figure at the time, Chen Yun, who was certainly, he wasn't as powerful as Deng Xiaoping. He didn't have the military ties that were as close as Deng, but he was certainly the second most powerful person in China, particularly with regard to economy at that time. And he was still a believer in central planning and command economy. But what happens then is, they go into this period of the 80s. And of course, Chen Yun is playing an important role at this time. But Deng Xiaoping is watching these experiments going on in Sichuan province with the provincial, I guess he was party secretary, Zhao Ziyang, and he sees the decollectivization and going back to household agriculture, leading to a boom in agriculture, things like that. And he'd had experience with this in the early 60s. To get out of the famine, they'd gone back to household agriculture. Mm-hmm. As a result, Deng Xiaoping got very severely criticized, and was why he was purged from leadership for quite a time. So they brought Zhao Ziyang to Beijing as prime minister, and then those reforms in agriculture began to really spread. I mean, it was a bottom-up affair, but with the top leaders at critical points saying going ahead. At that time, they still thought they were trying to improve central planning and the command economy. They weren't trying to move toward a market economy. So the first two things they did were this opening up to foreign trade, which meant big promotions of exports, and then the decollectivization of agriculture, and both were wildly successful. And so that just set the whole tone for gee, maybe we can do a lot of other things.
So there's several things that one can think about. First of all, you have a government that in some sense goes ahead by undoing some of the Maoist era policies, like collectivization. They go back to family farming as the kind of foundation. Even if the farmers still don't own the land, nevertheless they have control over its output. So some of it is by undoing. Some of it then is perhaps by direct learning what has happened in Taiwan, what has happened in Korea. Is there an area of real innovation in this realm, something that would be unexpected out of the East Asian playbook from other countries?
Well, I think most of the learning from Korea and Taiwan comes a little bit later. It certainly was there. I remember early on meeting with some Chinese delegations, and I had done some work on the Korean economy, and they were very interested in the books we did and earlier studies of what the Korean economy had done. But in that first phase, I would say the critical things were you had one, Deng, who was open to anything that worked. You had Zhao Ziyang, who was open to all kinds of ideas. He wanted ideas. He had two what were seen later, and to some degree you could say then, were quite radical think tanks. The Systems Reform Institute and then the Rural Development Group that were headed by a man named Du Rensheng. And then began experimenting with much more radical reforms. I mean, initially it was mostly agriculture. Not only to go back to household agriculture, but to free up rural markets and to not entirely remove the state quotas for purchases and so on, but to basically move toward more market distribution. So that leads to this big jump in rural incomes. It's not until '84, late '84, that they actually begin to tackle the urban scene, and particularly to tackle industry. At that point, the general
state-owned industry,
state-owned industries, everything's state-owned for the most part. I mean, there's some what they call collectively owned firms, and we'll get back to that in a moment. But they tried the kinds of things that Eastern European countries did, not terribly successfully. You could slightly improve the performance of the state enterprises by changing the incentives for the management and so on. But the reality was you didn't go very far in that regard. Then in 1984, they went to actually freeing up a large part of industrial inputs. And the idea was that they would, and then there would be a market for these inputs, and anybody could purchase them. at the market price. The market price was much higher than the state price in this case. So the state enterprises insisted on keeping the state prices for them. So you got this dual price system, which will cause trouble later. But for everybody else, you could purchase input. And they had in the 70s a development of what they call rural small-scale industry. And so there were a lot of little industries in the countryside, quite a number also in the cities, sort of small collective enterprises. These and others like them that had gained experience with management and the availability of inputs. You know, in the past they had to go to the central planners, they had to apply. They were way down the priority list. They hardly ever got anything. Now, all they had to do was go buy the things. And so there was a huge boom in what it came to be called township and village enterprises, which actually is what carries the GDP growth and the industrial growth for the next 7, 8, 10 years. These changes don't improve the state enterprise performance much. Basically, they probably improve it a little bit. But the state enterprises are still living off these subsidies through the lower prices, and then they get credits from the banks. But you're basically moving without really being conscious of what you're fully doing. That is what the government was fully doing. They were moving toward a market economy. Some of the radical think tanks clearly understood that, but most of the people in the leadership, I think, did not fully understand how fast this was going.